into a war. If Hamas is ever in a position in the future that they can threaten or attack Israel, you're not going to have peace. Okay? You're not going to convince anyone to invest money in Gaza if they believe another war is going to happen in 2 to 3 years. So I would just ask everyone to focus on what are the kind of weaponries and capabilities that Hamas would need in order to threaten or attack Israel as a baseline for what disarmament needs to look like. Because you're not going to have peace. If 2 years from now Hamas is launching rockets or killing Israelis or carrying out, God forbid, another 7th of October type terrorist attack and so forth, you're not going to have peace. So who's going to invest in a peace? Who's going to invest in rebuilding a place that's going to get destroyed again in a future war? So that's why disarmament is so critical. Now, what that entails, we're going to leave that to the technical teams to work on. It would have to be something, obviously, that they're willing to agree to, that our partners can push them and pressure them to agree to. It also has to be something that Israel agrees to. In order for that to work, both sides have to agree on.
Listen to me carefully, because what you just heard is not simply a diplomatic statement about ceasefire negotiations. What you just witnessed is the architecture of permanent subjugation being constructed in real time using the sanitized language of international relations and security cooperation. And I want you to understand something fundamentally obscene about the framework Marco Rubio just articulated as Trump's Secretary of State, because here we have an American official declaring that peace in Gaza depends on ensuring Hamas has no capacity to threaten Israel, framing the entire disarmament conversation around Israeli security and foreign investment, while completely erasing from the equation any notion of Palestinian security, Palestinian sovereignty, or the utterly asymmetric military reality that has resulted in over 70,000 Palestinian deaths according to Gaza's health ministry, and a civilian casualty rate that Israeli intelligence data shows reaches 83% of those killed, a ratio that conflict researchers say is almost unparalleled in modern warfare, matched only by the Rwandan genocide, Srebrenica, and Russia's siege of Mariupol. And you need to feel the moral vertigo of this moment, because we're being asked to accept a vision of peace that requires the complete military disarmament of a resistance movement, while the most powerful military force in the Middle East, backed by $421 billion in U.S. aid since the genocidal war began, according to the Cost of War Project, maintains total military superiority and continues to kill Palestinians even during what we're calling a ceasefire, with over 360 Palestinians killed and over 900 injured since the October ceasefire began, while Israeli forces expand their control over Gaza through what they euphemistically call the Yellow Line. Watch how Rubio constructs the rhetorical trap, because he pivots immediately to economics and reconstruction, saying you're not going to convince anyone to invest money in Gaza if they believe another war is going to happen in 2 to 3 years, clients of its beginning, and this framing does something ideologically devastating, because it redefines peace, not as the absence of structural violence or occupation or siege, but as the conditions necessary for capital investment, for the smooth operation of international finance capital in a territory that has been systematically destroyed by Israeli airstrikes and bombing that killed over 69,000 Palestinians and destroyed homes, hospitals, schools, shelters, religious sites, and essential services like bakeries, as if the primary concern facing Gaza is not the annihilation of its population, but rather the confidence levels of international investors. And you should recognize this neoliberal reframing for exactly what it represents, which is the subordination of Palestinian life and dignity and self-determination to the requirements of global capital and the security architecture that protects it. The entire moral universe gets inverted, so that the question becomes not how do we end occupation and apartheid and genocide, but rather how do we create stable conditions for economic development under continued Israeli military dominance. And this is the same logic that has justified every colonial project in human history, where indigenous resistance to dispossession gets reframed as an impediment to progress and modernization and investment. And let me tell you what makes this moment so explosively significant, because these comments come as Rubio expresses confidence that the first phase of the Gaza ceasefire will be completed very soon, and he wouldn't be drawn on how much Hamas needs to disarm following reports it is ready to lay down some weapons under certain conditions, which means we are at a critical juncture where Hamas officials say talks in Miami to advance the next phase must aim to end Israeli truce violations, as Trump's special envoy Steve Witkoff meets with officials from Qatar, Egypt, and Turkey. Qatar's prime minister has warned that daily Israeli breaches of the ceasefire are threatening the entire agreement, stressing that delays and ceasefire violations endanger the entire process and place mediators in a difficult position. Yet the American position, as articulated by Rubio, places the burden of peace entirely on Palestinian disarmament, while Israeli violations continue systematically and with impunity. This is what imperial management of conflict looks like in practice, where one side must completely surrender its capacity for armed resistance, while the other maintains overwhelming military force and the legal and political cover to use it whenever it deems necessary under the rubric of security. But here's where the analysis needs to go deeper into the material reality that this diplomatic language obscures, because what Rubio is really describing when he talks about disarmament and reconstruction and investment is a vision of Gaza as an open-air prison managed by international technocrats under Israeli security oversight, and we know this because the Trump administration's plan includes Hamas disarmament, the beginning of reconstruction, and the establishment of post-war governance, while the broader peace plan calls for dividing Gaza into an Israeli-controlled outer zone and a coastal region occupied by a U.S.-led international force, before power is transferred to Palestinian technocrats under a board of peace chaired by Trump, with UN Security Council authorization to operate until 2027, which is to say that Palestinian self-determination gets replaced by an American-designed governance structure operating under the shadow of continued Israeli military presence. This is not sovereignty, this is not liberation, this is the formalization of permanent colonial administration dressed up in the language of peace and stabilization and humanitarian reconstruction, and the fact that it's being marketed as a path to peace should radicalize anyone who believes in genuine decolonization and self-determination. And I want you to sit with the obscene asymmetry embedded in every single word Rubio speaks, because when he says if Hamas is ever in a position in the future that they can threaten or attack Israel, you're not going to have peace. He's articulating a security framework that treats Palestinian resistance to occupation as the fundamental threat to peace, while Israel committed genocide in Gaza, including by causing some of the highest known death tolls among children, journalists, and health and humanitarian workers of any recent conflict in the world, and deliberately inflicting on Palestinians conditions calculated to bring about their physical destruction, according to Amnesty International's documentation. Famine took hold in Gaza City in August 2025, with all three thresholds of famine, catastrophic hunger, acute malnutrition, and mass death officially surpassed, with IRC staff reporting people collapsing in the streets from emaciation, and children digging through trash piles for food with nothing left to find, and famine conditions remain a deadly reality, with almost 55,000 children facing acute malnutrition, and over 500,000 people facing catastrophic conditions characterized by disease and destitution. So the framework treats Hamas rockets as an existential threat requiring complete disarmament, while Israeli policies of deliberate starvation and mass civilian killing and infrastructure destruction get discussed as regrettable but understandable responses to security concerns. And if you cannot see the genocidal logic embedded in that double standard, then you are not paying attention to how imperial violence always justifies itself through the dehumanization of colonized peoples. Let's talk about what disarmament actually means in this context, because Rubio is deliberately vague about the details, saying we're going to leave that to the technical teams to work on. But reporting indicates Rubio doesn't rule out the possibility that the U.S. will pursue a Hamas disarmament plan, differentiating between heavy and light weaponry. Asked whether the U.S. is prepared to accept reported Hamas willingness to give up heavy weapons while holding lighter ones, and he deflects by saying focus on what kind of weapons and capabilities Hamas would need to threaten or attack Israel, as a baseline for what disarmament needs to look like, which reveals the entire framework is calibrated around Israeli threat perception, rather than any mutual disarmament or security guarantees or recognition that Palestinians have legitimate security needs against an occupying power that has demonstrated its willingness to kill them en masse. The technical question of which specific weapon systems Hamas must surrender becomes a proxy for the political question of whether Palestinians will be allowed any capacity for self-defense against continued Israeli aggression, and the answer being constructed through these negotiations is clearly no. Palestinians must be rendered completely defenseless, while trusting that international guarantees and technocratic governance will somehow protect them from the same forces that just spent 2 years systematically destroying their society. And the language about both sides have to agree on it that Rubio uses is such transparent ideological manipulation, because he says it would have to be something obviously that they're willing to agree to, that our partners can push them and pressure them to agree to. It also has to be something that Israel agrees to. In order for that to work, both sides have to agree on it, which creates this false symmetry, as if Hamas and Israel are negotiating from positions of equal power, rather than the reality that Israel controls approximately 58% of Gaza, even under the ceasefire, and Hamas is negotiating under conditions of total siege and destruction and genocide. So when Rubio talks about pushing and pressuring Hamas to agree, he's describing coercion of a stateless people facing extermination, while Israeli agreement is treated as a voluntary choice from a sovereign nation, and this linguistic sleight of hand conceals the power relations that make this anything but a negotiation between equals. This is the language of imperial diktat presented as mutual compromise, and Palestinians are being told to accept permanent military inferiority as the price of ending a genocide that never should have been perpetrated in the first place. But let me bring you into the absolute heart of what makes this formulation so morally repugnant, because notice what is completely absent from Rubio's entire framework, which is any discussion of Israeli disarmament or constraints on Israeli military power or accountability for Israeli war crimes, or recognition that Israeli military force is what killed 8,900 Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad fighters. According to Israeli intelligence, over the same period Gaza's health authorities recorded at least 53,000 deaths from Israeli attacks, meaning that the vast majority of those killed were civilians, and the number of injured exceeds 100,000, with Gaza having the most amputated children per capita in the world. Yet there is no corresponding demand that Israel must disarm, or that Israeli settlements must be dismantled, or that the Israeli military must withdraw from the occupied territories, or that Israeli forces must face prosecution for subjecting thousands of Palestinians to arbitrary detention and ill treatment amounting to torture in many cases. The entire security architecture being constructed treats Palestinian armed resistance as the problem that must be eliminated, while Israeli state violence is naturalized as a legitimate security response. And this is precisely how occupation becomes permanent, because the colonized are required to give up all means of resistance, while the colonizer maintains monopoly on force. And when we examine the humanitarian catastrophe that provides the context for these negotiations, the numbers become so overwhelming that they threaten to collapse into abstraction, but we must force ourselves to sit with them because at least 1,373 Palestinians were killed between May and July 2025 while seeking food, and the Gaza Ministry of Health noted the number of casualties among people trying to access food supplies increased to 1,655 fatalities and more than 11,000 injuries since May 2025, which means Palestinians are being shot while trying to feed themselves during what's supposedly a period of stabilization, and UN agencies urge immediate action to flood Gaza with aid to address catastrophic humanitarian conditions, including starvation and deaths from malnutrition, with nearly 12,000 children under 5 identified as suffering from acute malnutrition in July, the highest monthly figure recorded to date. Mediators Egypt and Qatar say Israel is not allowing in the quantity or type of aid agreed to in the ceasefire deal, despite Israel saying it's allowing hundreds of trucks daily, with the UN reporting a quarter of families in Gaza still eating only one meal a day, and basic medicines like antibiotics largely still unavailable. So Israel is actively creating the conditions for mass starvation, while American officials focus their energy on ensuring Hamas cannot threaten Israeli security. And if that moral inversion doesn't radicalize you, then I question whether you have any capacity for moral reasoning at all. Let's excavate the historical and philosophical frameworks that make this moment comprehensible, because what we're witnessing is not an aberration, but rather the logical culmination of liberal peacemaking under conditions of settler colonialism, and there's a direct lineage from the Camp David process to Oslo, to the Abraham Accords, to this Trump-Gaza plan, where Palestinian political aspirations are systematically subordinated to Israeli security requirements and American geopolitical interests, and the demands of capital accumulation. The pattern repeats across decades, where Palestinians are offered limited autonomy in exchange for accepting permanent military disadvantage and abandoning claims to meaningful sovereignty, and when they resist these terms they get labeled as rejectionists and obstacles to peace and existential threats requiring military defeat. And this is how power perpetuates itself through the discourse of conflict resolution, by defining the terms of acceptable political outcomes in ways that entrench existing hierarchies. Hamas's head abroad, Khalid Mashal, is trying to convince the U.S. to follow Hamas's own vision on how to deal with disarmament, saying Hamas aims to create a situation with guarantees that war does not return between Gaza and Israeli occupation, which includes the group potentially handing over weapons, though it wants input on the process. But this vision gets dismissed as insufficient because it insists on Palestinian agency and political standing, rather than simply accepting whatever terms Israel and America dictate. And I need you to understand the geopolitical context that shapes every word of Rubio's statement, because in March, Rubio announced Washington would send $4 billion in emergency military assistance to Israel, proudly saying the Trump administration had approved $12 billion in U.S. military sales to Israel since taking office, and considering the mounting death toll from Israel's genocidal war and international condemnation, Trump's continued full-throated support has unnerved some in his base who find the support doubly offensive, facing a struggling economy, affordability crisis, spiraling healthcare costs, and government shutdowns, while aid to Israel continues without pause. And even Trump ally Marjorie Taylor Greene earned Trump's fury after calling out the genocide, humanitarian crisis, and starvation in Gaza, which reveals fissures in the domestic consensus around unconditional support for Israel. Yet the official policy remains unchanged because the strategic alliance and arms industry profits and ideological commitment to Israeli supremacy override all other considerations, including mass civilian death and documented genocide. This is American empire in practice, where client states receive billions in military aid to prosecute wars against colonized populations, while American politicians debate whether the aid package is large enough. The question of reconstruction that Rubio emphasizes so heavily deserves particular scrutiny, because when he says who's going to invest in rebuilding a place that's going to get destroyed again in a future war, he's revealing that the entire framework treats future Palestinian resistance as inevitable, rather than addressing why such resistance emerges in the first place, which is the occupation and siege and denial of political rights and systematic violence. So instead of dismantling the structures of oppression that generate resistance, the plan is to demilitarize the oppressed while creating conditions for international capital to rebuild infrastructure that will remain under Israeli security control. And we've seen this playbook before in Iraq and Afghanistan, and throughout the global south, where reconstruction becomes another vector for imperial penetration and debt peonage and technocratic management that displaces local political agency. And Gaza is being prepared for this same treatment, where Gaza's infrastructure is shattered after 2 years of war, and while the ceasefire marks the beginning of an opportunity to rebuild, it will take decades of sustained support and reconstruction for communities to find any sense of normalcy again, which means Gaza will be dependent on international donors and financial institutions and NGOs for generations, creating permanent leverage over Palestinian political development, and ensuring that any government that emerges must satisfy donor demands and Israeli security requirements before it can address Palestinian needs. And let's be absolutely explicit about what the Trump administration's vision actually entails, because the United States, through its newly created Civil Military Coordination Center, has taken over facilitation of humanitarian assistance to Gaza from the Israelis, and the administration put forth an ambitious UN Security Council resolution to authorize the multinational stabilization force, defined as an enforcement force, not peacekeepers, and a governance role for at least 2 years, despite Israel never wanting UN Security Council involvement in its national policy, and the U.S. almost always deferring to Israeli wishes, which represent an unprecedented, fundamental, and potentially irreversible change in U.S.-Israeli relations, where Trump has leverage over Netanyahu, and unlike his predecessors is not afraid to use it. Yet this shift isn't toward supporting Palestinian self-determination, but rather toward a more direct American role in managing the occupation and pacification of Gaza. The United States isn't pressuring Israel to end the occupation, but rather to accept an American-led governance structure that can more efficiently administer Palestinian subjugation while maintaining the fiction of a peace process. And this represents the evolution of imperial management from indirect rule through a proxy state to more direct American involvement in colonial administration. What absolutely cannot be ignored is how the ceasefire that Israel has violated more than 700 times since it began, according to Gaza's government media office, as Israel has not allowed the free flow of humanitarian aid in violation of the truce's terms, while hundreds of thousands suffer through storms with only makeshift tents for shelter. Since the October ceasefire began, Israel has continued to attack Gaza on a daily basis, carrying out nearly 800 attacks and killing nearly 400 people, according to Gaza authorities, while blocking the free flow of humanitarian aid. Yet the American position remains that Hamas must disarm, while Israeli violations receive only tepid diplomatic criticism at most. This reveals the entire framework of both sides' rhetoric as fundamentally dishonest, because one side is being held to absolute standards of demilitarization, while the other operates with complete impunity to kill Palestinians, even during supposed ceasefires, and the pattern demonstrates that what's being constructed is not peace but rather the formalization of Israeli military dominance and Palestinian defenselessness, which is precisely the condition that enabled the genocide in the first place. And I want to conclude by drawing the connections between this specific negotiating position and broader patterns of imperial violence, because what Rubio articulates is the same logic that justified disarming indigenous peoples throughout the Americas, the same framework that demanded insurgents in Iraq and Afghanistan surrender while occupation forces remained, the same structure that required the defeated to accept terms that perpetuated their subordination while calling it peace. For over 2 years, Israel has subjected Palestinians in Gaza to genocide, with rhetoric and conduct of Israeli forces reflecting beyond military objectives an accompanying intent to destroy a substantial part of the Palestinian population. And now Palestinians are being told that the path to ending this genocide requires them to completely disarm and trust in international guarantees from the same powers that armed Israel and provided diplomatic cover for 2 years of mass killing. This is not a peace process. This is the consolidation of colonial victory, dressed in the language of conflict resolution and humanitarian reconstruction, and every single person who cares about justice and decolonization and Palestinian liberation needs to reject this framework entirely and demand something fundamentally different, which is the dismantling of occupation, the return of refugees, the establishment of genuine Palestinian sovereignty, free from Israeli military control, and accountability for the genocide that created this catastrophic present. The question is not what weaponry Hamas must surrender, but rather what political and material structures of oppression must be dismantled to create conditions for actual peace. And until American officials are willing to address that question honestly, every talk of ceasefire and reconstruction and investment remains nothing more than imperial management of an ongoing crime against humanity.